And I like to add that we have a kick-ass research and design chapter, and we will soon start hiring for 2 researchers and 1 product designer. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out to either me or Harmyan. All right, just as a reminder, please use the chat function to submit your questions. And at the end of each talk, depending on how much time is left, we'll go through your questions and ask some of them from the speakers. Our first speaker is Harmyan. He is the design chapter lead in WBAA, but he does so much more than that, and you learn it within the first few minutes of talking to him. He is always working on cool or bizarre side projects with a positive impact, and from experience, I can say that no conversation is dull once you involve Harmyan. So you can always rely on him to push back on ideas that are not well-founded in evidence or not tested thoroughly. And today he is going to talk to us about dashboards, something designers get asked to create quite often, especially in data-driven teams or corporates. And we are going to learn when they work or don't work and how to push back. So without further ado, Harmyan, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Parisa. Really looking forward to this, and thanks for the great introduction. Looking at the schedule, I think I've just won 10 minutes extra. So I think that's really good, because I really had to cramp in all the things I put down in paper into 30 minutes. So let's see how far we can get. So today I'd like to talk about dashboards. And for me, dashboards are these crazy things you see in a lot of products. So it's basically a thing that more or less just happens when people start building so-called solutions. So the thing about dashboards is that people always ask for them. Dashboards are being brought as a solution by the business, as the end goal, the flag in the ground that shows them cool stuff, crazy moving parts with all kinds of numbers and statuses. But this is basically asking users what they want, where we instead, especially as researchers, also as designers, we should be finding ourselves in the place we are in the best, in the place we need to also be in, and that's the place of starting to understand the problem. So we tend to resort to a dashboard as a response to not really understanding the full scale of a problem space. So here's the short story to my story when you need dashboards. So the answer is it's hardly ever. So today I would like to tell you why it is that dashboards are almost never a thing users need, and how to better address the problem and how to validate if the proposed solution still needs a dashboard. But in order to understand where we are today, we always have to look where we're coming from. So how did those dashboards end up in our lives, and why do we still see them that often? And to get there, I will start with enriching all of your lives with my amazing drawing skills. So here we go. Here we go. So back in the days, a few centuries ago, when there was no COVID-19, we discovered that wooden wheels offered us more comfort in letting us be transported by a horse. As you can all see, this is clearly a horse. It even has a really nice tail. So we discovered that it offered us more comfort in letting us be transported by a horse and by a carriage. I'll just make sure to make the difference between a horse and a carriage, horse and carriage. But the problem with this setup currently is that the horse could be spirited and really active. And another word of a spirited horse is a dashing horse. So you might already find out where this will end. So this behavior could cause the horse to kick up mud. You can clearly see I will make some mud and rocks, towards the driver of the carriage. So here was somewhere over here, there was a driver, and this person, was clearly not happy. As you can see, not happy. So what they did, they created a wooden plank to prevent the mud and the rocks from hitting the driver. And as you can imagine, this would make the driver way more happy. And at the end of the 18th century, and also the beginning of the 19th century, we turned those horsepowers into things we now know as cars. But the problem of the first problem with the dashing horse, where it would kick up mud, so I'll just make it visible again, still wasn't gone. So what they would do is take the dashboard and put it inside the car, over here. And at some point, we were able to show some of the statuses coming out of this system to the driver. So the most convenient place to put those indicators was going to be in the dashboard. And as you all know, a dashboard is not a standalone thing. And for UX, context is an incredibly important factor to take into account. So most of the time, the dashboard was part of a cockpit. And since we're already started embarking this story in the world of etymology, I will also have to explain where this word comes from. So please bear with me. The first explanation is easy to follow. So put a set of angry roosters or cocks in a pit. So a pit is actually just a dent in the ground, and you would have yourself a cockpit. But quite early in the 1700s, soldiers start using this cockpit as a metaphor for the sight of grisly combat, especially when the fighting was in an enclosed area. So a dent in the ground, a pit. This then was adopted by pilots in World War I, who applied it to the cramped operating quarters of their fighter planes, their war machines. Because this thing is, after all, still a small pit where plenty of fighting took place. So there you go, there it is. This was part one of the history of the dashboard in the cockpit. And not to forget those amazing historical drawings. I now want to skip ahead of the beginning of the 19th century. I want to talk about what happened there, how fear created a deep-rooted connection to a dashboard, and how these things had a big impact on the user experience today. So as you can imagine, or I think we can hardly imagine, these were tough times, World War I, World War II. There was even this German saying where they said, when they had this talk about pilots, where they said, sterben war ihr tägliches Brot. Saying, well, if you would be a pilot, then you would probably end up in a coffin, if you were to be a pilot. So the next little story I want to talk about is about this war machine. It's a famous but also an infamous war machine, and that will tell us how fear was an integral part of cockpit, but also how these planes influenced the machine. The same machine you're currently using, or most of you are currently using, whilst listening to me. So this was the B-17 bomber, also known as the Flying Fortress, a menace in the sky and the pride of the US Army Air Corps in World War II. So pilot would navigate the skies, weaving through and tearing down Japanese and German forces, surviving shrapnel and bullets before making it back as, how they would call it, a series of holes held together by wrecked metal. But there was only one problem with this B-17 Flying Fortress. They just could not seem to stick the landing. So the plane could hold up a crew of 10, pilot, co-pilot, bomber, navigator, flight engineers, and 5 gunners, and could take down the enemy in a rock-flying fortress, but was unable to land. On coming in to land, the wing flaps, these things over there, would slow the plane down, and it would then hit the runway, skid, and keel over, turn over on the runway, leaving carnage in its path. The landing gear wouldn't descend. This went on for a while, and the incidents piled up. Pilots misreading dials, pilots falling out of the sky because they could not tell which side was up when flying, pilots unable to read instruments clearly, and even an instance of a pilot running a plane up and down the runway during an attack because the cockpit instrument had been rearranged in what was a new model and he just couldn't figure out how to fly. So whether this was stress or trauma, incompetence or freak accidents, pilots were taking the blame for the accidents that were causing damage to machinery worth thousands of dollars, and of course, more importantly, the death of all its crew members. Data showed that during one 22-month period of the war, the Air Force reported an astounding 475 crashes, just like the one in which our imaginary pilot hit the runway thinking everything was fine. But the culprit was maddeningly obvious for anyone with patience to look. When they started investigating the airplanes themselves, so talking about qualitative foundational research, talking to people about them, sitting in the cockpits, they also didn't see the evidence of poor training. Instead, they saw the impossibility of flying these planes at all. Instead of pilot error, this was the first time people introduced the term design error. So back in those days, with this research, a new paradigm was born. And this paradigm was really important, but I will just come back to that in a minute. Just for the reason why there were so many accidents happening with this flying fortress, the problem was that the pilots were crashing when they were easing into landing because the flaps and the landing gear controls, as you can hardly see on the left, looked exactly the same. So the pilots were simply reaching for the landing gear, thinking they were ready to land, but instead they were pulling the wing flaps, making the machine or the plane go down even faster, and slowing their descent and driving their planes into the ground, and also with the landing gear still tucked in. So coming back to this paradigm, this shift of thinking, looking at design errors, this had an impact or a start in our expertise of today. So this new paradigm of design error took root slowly at first, but in 1984, by the way, a really good year, 4 decades after these studies, Apple created a computer for the rest of us and said, since computers are so smart, wouldn't it make sense to teach computers about people instead of teaching people about computers? So, talking about a world of fear in the 19th century, and I don't want to elaborate too much around history, but we've seen other examples where technology, cockpits, and dashboard played an important part. So nuclear disasters in the Ukraine, the US, and Japan showed us the strong correlation between the dashboard and fear. A deep-rooted correlation for us trying to be in control as much as possible to avoid fear and danger by using dashboards. The 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania was actually mostly because of a human error problem, or a design problem. After the accident, there was this guy who investigated the scene to find what caused this error. You might know the guy. His name is Don Norman, the same person that coined the term human-centered design, and also the same person who started the company where probably a larger part of you did the training. Norman said, the control room and computer interfaces at 3 Mile Island could not have been more confusing if they had tried. He explained how the linear array of buttons, switches, and indicators arranged in equally spaced straight lines may have had made sense on paper to engineers, but were not intuitive to plant operators at all. So this was the last part of the history lesson, the history of the dashboard and the cockpit, where people acted as the central processing unit in this world of fear. So let us now go back to today and see what changed in terms of technology, but how behavior is still quite the same. So we used to have dashboards positioned like this. So we had some machines with their statuses, there were some mechanical gauges, and that were directly linked to a dashboard, making the user processing all the signals, trying to be in control and trying to control their fears. But yeah, this changed luckily because we're now living in a more modern world. So we still have machines somewhere in the end of our spectrum. Beginning of 19th century, we discovered the electrons, and therefore we developed electronics. And you can tie these electronics to a central processing unit that's then now being connected to a dashboard. But the thing is, somehow the user still wants to be in control, and most of the time, especially in terms of a dashboard, the user is still being acted as a processing unit. And here's the key thing. Dashboards themselves are completely passive. They're not a job to be done. They're never part of a really delightful journey or a really efficient task. And since they are passive, the user has to find, process, study them, and has to figure out if there's something she or he has to pay attention to. So in the end, still the user has to do all the work. So the user has to process the signals, although we know we have solutions in place, like this little blue box, who can do that for us. And the odds of the user making a mistake by either not paying attention to the dashboard, or not knowing when the number is trying to tell them something, or not being able to know what to do about it, those are basically mistakes waiting to be happen. So dashboards are problematic. They are designed elements that are partially implemented and not done. So I like to take this apart and see how we can prevent this, or as Parisa said, how we can push this back a little bit better. And I like to show you how to approach this thing, by using a model from Jared Spool. So we can think of a dashboard as a solution, as a type of solution, as a proposed solution. But as a designer, and that's the important part here, you always have to think at the UX outcome. So this is the UX outcome. And the UX outcome basically answers the question, and I will just type it out here. If we do a good job, if we do a good job, how will it, sorry, I have a pen in my hand, improve someone's life? Okay. So this is what the UX outcome tells us. So this is UX. I think UX and a journey, it's always about an improvement in someone's life. And what we want to talk about is what is the improvement that we want to deliver to our user. So a dashboard gives transparency into a system, but does that contribute to the actual improvement? And that's the question we need to answer. Does that give user improvement? So this, like a lot of other things, starts with understanding. And of course, we only gain understanding through research. So what we really need to understand is the problem we're trying to solve. Problem to solve. And one way of framing the problem is that we look at what the current user experience is. Current. I will just abbreviate this because I think most of you will know the abbreviation. Current user experience. So let's take a look at this little example from Tesla. I'll just zoom in a bit. So this is another dashboard visibility into a system. So it shows the energy spent in the past 5 miles, and it should encourage a driver to be more energy aware and drive more economically. The thing is, nobody uses this because the user problem to solve, is not clear. What probably a better solution would be to let the computer do all this processing and benchmarking and just adjust acceleration accordingly. So in the end, we can just hand over the solution to the computer, let somebody else do the processing. So we can get rid of the dashboard solution, and suddenly we have a different solution to our problem. Let me just zoom out a little bit more. And as you all know, great designers don't fall in love with the solution. Great designers fall in love with the problem. So the more we know about our problem, the better we do our research, the more we're going to understand it, the better we will come up with a solution, which is hardly ever a dashboard. So there's also a follow-up approach to this, and it's really simple. So what if we still feel the solution is a reflection of signals that needs to be processed? Doesn't that just sound like a dashboard? In that case, the next thing that you want to ask yourself is, can a machine do it? And in order to test that assumption, I always apply a rule of thumb from Andrew Ng. He's kind of the godfather of machine learning and AI. This rule always helps me define if we really should show something to the user or stick to the known sayings like "don't make me think," kind of focuses. So these rules always help me define if I should really build something and I should really bother the user with a solution. And it's basically saying, can we, what the user could do within a second, is it something we can learn a computer to do? And if we can, then we let the computer learn it, and we don't bother the user by doing it. So I will just read it out. Anything a typical human can do within 1 second of thought, we can probably now or soon automate with AI. And I've never seen this rule of thumb broken in the products and projects we're working on. So I really find this a useful rule of thumb coming from the godfather of machine learning. So let's take these models to the test. And then I'm finishing off. Case 1, this is a dashboard, and excuse my Dutch, but this is the latest dashboard I came across because I got the assignment for people to help me out redesigning this dashboard, and it basically just ended up with not having a dashboard because it was not clear at all which problems we're going to solve with this dashboard. So this is a dashboard for fleet managers. So this is a role within the company that take care of all the lease cars. And it's just showing a lot of information, but it's not solving any problem that the fleet manager would have. So in the end, the fleet manager, the challenge is, or their goal is to make sure everybody's happy by using their car, everyone is safe, and not too much money is being spent purposely. So the outcome of this exercise would just be we can let the computer create a benchmark and see if some people are really outliers in that sense that they maybe use their travel card or the card they can actually fuel up with used for other cars than their lease car. So this is just a really easy signal you can create by a computer. And the rest of those widgets, like how many people use or do fuel up their cars on a highway, and what are the costs of the total fleet management. These are just for the tasks that the fleet manager has are totally not applicable. So this was an easy one, but I do want to point out I still see a lot of these things, and once you start asking basic questions, it just doesn't hold up to really create these kind of dashboards. Then we have the speedometer, and in the end, the speedometer is only required for one reason: to help you comply with the law. So if you're driving in an environment with no speed limits, such like an off-road or a racetrack, you don't need a speedometer. And indeed, many race cars don't have one. And a competent driver, so being more aware of the possibilities of the user itself, should be able to assess the safe speed without reference to their speedo based on the current weather conditions, topography of the road, and quality of the road surface, presence of other road users and nearby pedestrians or animals, etc. So knowing your speed doesn't help you to do this. In some cases, can even become a distraction. So the problem to solve here is that we want people to comply with the law. And we can ask ourselves, since we have the information, since we know what the speed limits are on our roads and are on the ways, then probably a computer can learn this or can do this within a second. It's just a correlation of real basic data, and we don't have to pay attention to any of these numbers in our dashboards. So we can get rid of the speedometer, and then I'm even not talking about autonomous driving yet. Then the last case, I had the privilege to work on this cockpit. So this is an air traffic control cockpit over at Amsterdam. It's actually not in Schiphol itself. It's actually in Hoofddorp, so nearby Schiphol, because there are a lot more air traffic controllers than just in the tower of Schiphol. But those people have one of the world's most stressful jobs. So in this cockpit, there's a life and death element, and plus the need for like razor sharp reactions on everything, like a terrorist attack or extreme weather, things coming through other channels. And despite the apparent complexity of the task and the high-tech appearance, it's still a job that relies completely on the ability and the skill of the user. So these are just a lot of signals that the user has to process and has to be really sharp and really heavily trained in order to make the right decisions. This is something that currently we cannot let the machine learn this. So this still needs capabilities of the user itself. This still needs processing of our user. So yeah, here you have it. So I hope next time, if you're being dragged into a dashboard, please remind my key takeaways. First of all, focus on the desired UX outcome. And then second, ask yourself if a machine can do it. And remember, you hardly ever need a dashboard. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Harmjan, for that presentation. Very interesting history and very practical tips. If you have questions, please submit them in the chat, and I'll ask them from Harmjan. But I have a question myself. So if you already have been working on a dashboard for a product that you're working on, how would you transition to something better?
Yeah, I think that's actually the experience I had working on this latest, here's a dashboard, please fix some problems. And I think the shortest way is getting at it from a business perspective. So if you're really starting to talk about, okay, how will this also improve somebody's life and how can we make this measurable? So from all of the things we put into the dashboard, all the effort we put in of making this work to the user, what does it actually bring us? How will this improve business? And I think you can do a way better job by focusing on the UX outcome than just having a conversation with those business people about what the dashboard itself actually brings.
Yeah. Thanks. Good question. Good answer. Sorry. Another question that I have myself: how much do you think fear still has a deep connection with the dashboard?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. First of all, I wouldn't know exactly, but I really do believe that some things, some systems that have been there for ages and in earlier generations still have a big impact on us. And I sometimes compare dashboards to marriages, and I can imagine not a lot of people aligning with me on this. But back in the days, marriage was also just invented to gain extra land and to gain extra troops to fight your land. And at some point, a priest made it more, a priest had to be involved in order to make marriage less sinful or make your life less sinful. And nowadays, we still expect that a relation or a marriage is successful when in the end of the relation, we take each other to our graves. And I think this is also a really old way of thinking that's really deep-rooted and engraved from our history. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from the chat. Hanneke is asking, what is your experience when you propose to let go of the dashboard? I would think people like to feel as if they are in control and would be hesitant or scared to let go of a dashboard.
Yeah, so I do think that's indeed a big challenge, and there needs to be transition. You really need to bridge that gap. It's not that you can just take the thing away. That they always had the idea that there was something that really helped them out. So it's probably going to be painful, but it's better to process the pain if just bit by bit. So just having like deeper conversation on what you're actually trying to reach, I think then you can really improve the conversation itself and also get them along in not using a dashboard anymore, or really helping them out and gaining proof for that or evidence.
And Negin is asking, do you recommend that in order to build a dashboard, in addition to the user, we also make a persona for the machine, like Robona for robots, for example?
Yeah, well, I think, that's an interesting thought. I think in the end, what we're also trying to do when we're building more specialized model or algorithm, we somehow try to put that in a flow or in a model to explain to the user what's actually happening. And if you make those things, if you make especially systems more clear, and if you also want to reduce fear, also by being more transparent and just show what's actually happening, I think that would really help by making the entire story a way better. And if the machine has a larger part in that in your story, then it really sounds like a persona. That's something I will keep in mind. It's interesting.
Yeah, indeed. So I think that's the questions for now. Thank you again, Harmjan. It was very insightful. Now I'm gonna give the floor to Dan.
Hey everyone. We got a message we were not live in the beginning, so sorry for that. I would like to take the opportunity to welcome everybody to this first online edition of the UX Meetup. My name is Daniela Aarsen, and I am the event planner of the Wholesale Banking Advanced Analytics team, or WBAA in brief. We already had one amazing talk of our own Harmjan, and we still have 3 super cool talks left, so please stay tuned. It's still possible to ask questions via the live chat, so don't forget. And today your host and moderator is Parisa, and Parisa is a lead UX researcher in our tribe. and she will introduce you to WBAA and will guide you through the program. Teresa, I give you back the mic.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm just going to give you a very quick introduction to our tribe, which is hosting this meetup. Harmyan, which was the first speaker, and myself work at WBAA. So that's why if I'm in my introduction to WBAA, I say we, that's why. So here's the tribe. We work on new innovation products that either benefit our colleagues and processes at the bank itself or solve a real world problem for our clients. So we do work on both internal facing and external facing products and platforms, and sometimes we spin off some of these products as well. And one thing that all of them have in common, in addition to being new and innovative, is having an AR or advanced analytics core. As you can see here, we are an international tribe from many different nationalities, expanding over 4 countries, and we work in cross-functional teams, including some of the functions you see here at the bottom. And I just want to give a quick shout out that we are going to hire 2 researchers and 1 product designer soon. So if you are interested, get in touch with me or Harmyan. And that's it. Our next speaker is Beyond. Beyond is a senior researcher. She has worked for many years for Philips, and she is running her own freelance company, working with big names as well as startups. I'm always impressed by her creativity. I've known her for a while, and her creativity shows in her art, but also her work. And she runs an online class on the topic itself as well. And she is also the founder of Alt UXR and sends out very insightful emails about different topics related to research. And personally, I think those emails can be educational for any curious mind besides researchers as well. So you should check them out. And today she is going to talk to us about failure and how it can make us better. So Beyond, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Parisa. Thank you. Also, thank you to everybody who is listening. I'll start sharing my screen now and presenting. Okay, so today I want to talk about creativity and learning from failure. So this talk is part of a bigger workshop, and today I'm going to specifically focus on creativity, and we are going to learn how failure relates to creativity and how failing regularly and pursuing mastery are key to learning from failure. In case you don't have already, get a pen and paper because it helps to doodle or take notes when you're listening to something, also for other talks, because it activates different centers of your brain, and doodling also makes you more creative. A bit about myself. I think Parisa already gave a very kind introduction. I'm a senior user researcher, as she mentioned, so I do a lot of user research and testing with companies and people all over the world. I also founded Alt UXR, where I do theme-based emails and workshops and courses, like creativity, listening, and like learning from failure, also with people from many countries. And because I'm talking about creativity, it's relevant to say that I make art and I write, and that's where I started to learn about getting comfortable with failure and role of failure in creativity. So it was really a hands-on training in failure. Why am I talking about failure today? Because you could say this is a UX meetup. Why do we need to talk about failure? So I work in the UX world. This is what I do. And yet I find that in a lot of work that I do, I found myself often getting afraid of failure. So ironically, I found it very hard to finish the first version of this presentation, which was for another event, because I was afraid of failing. That's like metaphysical, right? But on the other hand, I also like creating and learning new things. And if I want to continue doing that, then I have to build a good relationship with failure. Also, as I grow older, I see that some failures that seemed terrible in the moment and like really heartbreaking they changed my perspective in really valuable ways or brought new opportunities which I could not have thought about. So I researched the topic. I also read about failure. I reflected on my own experience. I talked to some people around me, and I want to share part of that in today's talk. An overview of what I'll be talking about. So first, I'll do a quick check with you, or you can do a quick check with yourself on how do you or your team relate to failure. How can you provide a platform for failure? What do success, mastery, and perfection have to do with failure? And finally, if we have time, I would like to do a quick recap where actually you will tell me what you learned from the talk today or your one aha moment rather than me doing a recap for you. So I learned from your learning. Before we go forward, I always ask people to do this. Take a moment to set an intention for what do you want from this talk, at least for the next 20 to 25 minutes. I told you what I'll be talking about. So just take a moment to think and write down for yourself, this is what will make it a success. Like these 20 minutes, I'll find them well spent. So I'll give you 15, 20 seconds to think on that. Okay, then we go forward. So failure has many perspectives and angles, and it's a very rich topic. It's like life, and you can continue about it on a long, long conversation. We will talk today about creativity and failure. When it comes to creative endeavors, the concept of zero failures is worse than useless. It's counterproductive. These are words from Ed Catmull, who's the president of Pixar and Disney Animation. And Pixar and Disney are in the business of creativity. Like, this is what they survive on. So if they are talking about failure and creativity, we should pay attention. I have also experienced this myself. So when I'm creating anything or anything meaningful at any rate, I realize that creativity needs failure. Just this one sentence or concept, as you can see, has so many different versions. You start with one and you try to fit different things to it or you modify it. So every failure is a raw material for the creative process. And if you don't have a draft, you can't edit it. And this is true for a design, this is true for a project plan, this is true for a test plan. Anything you try to do, you first need to make something before you can think of making something successful. And of course, the deal with failure is that we want the first version already to be successful, right? And we'll talk about that in a bit. So failure feeds creativity. Let's take a moment and do a check on how do you relate to failure, which is a test from actually Ed Catmull, the same person who said you need failure for creativity. And this is a test to determine if you or your team or family view failure negatively. So what happens when something goes wrong? Does someone ask whose fault was this? And do people shut down and turn inwards instead of coming together to analyze and learn from the failure? And if the answer to these questions is yes, then failure is viewed negatively, right? So I'll just give you a moment to think on that. So if the answer to this was no, then I think you are lucky and you have quite a healthy attitude towards failure and we could all be learning from you. But what I have seen is that most organizations and most people have both these behaviors within them. That is both of embracing failure as well as of being opposed to it or resistant to it. It just depends on what area you're talking about. So how do you go around? Like if we are saying that creativity needs failure and that we need to have an open attitude towards failure, how do we embrace it? What does it mean to include failure in your day-to-day working? So we'll look at a couple of examples of building failure into the process. And they'll all show you different ways, and you can see if any of them speaks to you. The first example comes from Pixar itself, where they provide a platform for failing and learning at a low cost. So this is their way to defang failure. Basically, they actively ask people to fail regularly so that they can make, fail, and iterate quickly. They have this group called Brain Trust, where people come and present their movie drafts and reels. And then they get candid feedback from their colleagues on what works and what doesn't work. What's important here is that they are not presenting ideas. They are presenting made things. So something that's a deliverable, a draft, because Ed says that making is also a part of learning, even though you know you are not making the thing that's going to be final. So this meeting is not to get compliments from people. It's specifically to take your idea, your movie draft apart and say that this doesn't work and this has to work better. And he writes that basically all movies suck at the beginning. The brain trust is to say specifically in what way a movie sucks. And then the rest of the process is about making a movie unsuck, kind of. Which is a great way of looking at, that failure is inherently a part of process when you're trying to create a good movie, for example, at Pixar. So this was one way of embracing failure and making it a part of the process. Looking at my own process of building failure into creating anything, I first want to look at because I said most of us have both these parts within us. I first want to look at the part of myself where I operate from a place of fear and a fear of failure. So this used to be a lot, especially in the beginning of my career, where I would think of several options of whatever I was trying to do, whether a test plan or a painting, didn't matter. I would choose one, make it, and then get feedback and finalize it. Right? So I was thinking through a lot of options, unlike what Ed suggests, that you have to decide and make and not just think through things. So here in this process, my main focus was on avoiding criticism and keeping up my image of being an expert, right? I would also resent any major changes that came in because I had already spent a lot of time on it, so I didn't want to change any big things. I also felt the pressure to impress or succeed with whatever I was making because, this was one version where I had spent a lot of time and effort again. And the feedback was more a check to avoid a bigger failure for me. So it was more like, oh, is there any major blunder here? Rather than an active way to improve whatever I was doing. Slowly over the years, and I think I learned this from art and from doing new things, that I started embracing this concept of making and failing early. And I learned this only through doing because I had heard about it, but I didn't know what exactly it meant until I started doing it. So now, whenever I am doing something with an open attitude, where I am not afraid of failure, but I want to deliver the best work, I already start discussing initial ideas with somebody even before I've made anything. And I get some questions which are, because I'm also impatient, so I want to get to the finished product very quickly. So I also get irritated at the questions, which are very valuable and which also show me whatever I am understanding, I'm not able to convey to somebody else right now. So that's the first discussion. Based on that, I very quickly make an early draft, like the first draft. Then I show it to people. Because this is a really early draft, When I show it to a couple of people, the feedback I get is not on the font size, the language, the spelling errors. It's feedback that's like transformative. It's like big concepts. This concept is not working, or is it valuable? How does it fit with that? When I get this feedback, usually I go like, oh, I'll never be able to address this. This is too big. No, I'm not up to it. So there's this despairing phase. It may last for a few minutes, a few hours, or a day, depending on how big the project is that I'm working on. But by now, I know it's a part of the process, so I don't really bother. I'm like, yes, I'm in the despair phase. But then slowly from that despair, new ideas start arising, which lead to a big transformation in the work I am doing. And then after this transformation, I would do a pilot run, and then I would update and finalize, at least for the first edition. Of course, every time you do something, you get feedback on it and it gets better. But this is for the first complete cycle. And this seems like it has more steps, but actually this has made making things faster, even though it seems to have more steps, because I am less likely to get stuck in this loop of, oh, I don't really want to start that because I'm not in the right mood to deliver the perfect thing. This perfection story. So this builds smaller failures into the process. It helps me do better quality and more interesting and varied work. It gives me time to reflect on and digest the content. It also leads to bigger transformations and better learning rather than tiny fixes. So this was the second example from my own experience for integrating failure into the process. A third example was, and this has happened with a couple of teams, where you learn from success or failure after the fact. So you just make it a part of the process. So, for example, one of the teams I worked with, they had weekly sessions where you would present your projects and show what went well, what could be better, what we enjoyed, and what we didn't enjoy. So in this case, since you are not focused on if the project overall was a success or a failure, and you're doing it for every project, regardless of whether it's considered to be awesome or awful, also this was a way of destigmatizing failure, because the whole point was, what are we learning from it that you take to the next project? So success or failure of the project were not that relevant anymore. Learning was the more relevant part. So this is another example of integrating failure into the process, right? So normally I do this as a workshop, but right now this is homework for you if you want, if you're wondering how can I use it in my life. So think of an area in your life where you are afraid of failure or where failure hurts you. And think, how would you create a platform for embedding and embracing failure there on a regular basis so that it just becomes a part of the process. So this is the first homework, and then there will be another one, and it's up to you, of course, if you want to take this up. Now, I want to look at some relatives of failure on a related note. And I already touched on some of these concepts in the first part so far. Success, mastery, and perfection. I love this concept. It comes from Sarah Lewis, who is a professor of history and art, and she was also a curator at several museums. And she studied this process of creation, and she came up with this concept. Let's look at them one by one. So she says that success is an event-based victory at a specific moment in time. Mastery is about replicating success time and time again, which means that for mastery, you also have to know what works and what doesn't work, and under which circumstances, because otherwise your definition of success would be very narrow, and that's not true mastery. That's just about succeeding under a very narrow set of circumstances. So failing and learning from failure, or even deriving opportunities from failure, is a part of mastery. So it's inherent to mastering anything, whether that's design, whether that's user research, it's art, it's life, all of it. So it's a process, right? Rather than a destination or a single moment in time. And lastly, there is perfection. So perfection doesn't have much to do with making something or achieving something. It's more a concern with how others see us and our fear of being wrong. So this could be because of competition, because we look at somebody and we think we should be like them, or we are not good enough, or you want to be seen in a certain way. Or it could be because of fear of criticism, right? In my case, for example, usually perfection is related to fear of criticism more than competition, for example. And I know people who are driven by competitive spirit, and then for them, perfection is being better than X, for example, right? So here are a couple of examples. On the left is an eagle that I drew. So you could call this a success. This looks reasonably good, fine. So this is a success. Now on the right are different tries where I try to make an eagle in different poses. And some of them look like pigeons, some of them look like, I don't know, they don't even look like a bird. But this precisely is the process to mastering drawing an eagle. And this is a really simple example, but unless I get through this phase, I will never get to be somebody who draws an eagle well. Of course, I could pursue perfection, and I could refuse to draw an eagle unless I know that it's going to turn out just right, or that I'm sure that it will be a success, or that I don't show it to anybody unless that's the case. But I think most of you would agree that that would be a very narrow way of living or of making art. And yet we do impose such standards on ourselves, right? Not showing something to somebody unless it's that good, not doing something because it's not good enough. And this is often a script that goes through our minds for different areas, right? So I found this concept really powerful. And I was talking about it with a friend to see if somebody else also can relate to this concept. And interestingly, she told me that she is into or worried about writing perfect emails. So she's afraid of making a mistake when writing an email because being thorough and detailed is important to her. And she would not like to seem sloppy or shallow. So she checks every email 5 to 6 times to make sure that everything is okay, which is, of course, very time taking. And she doesn't like the worry that comes with it. So then we were discussing this, and I was asking her, what might mastery look like? So she said, well, being able to write a clear and error-free email without being worried, that would be like success for her. So then we were discussing this for a while. And then she said, actually, what would work would be making a list of what is important to check for. For example, am I being clear? Are there any spelling errors? And then using that list to check the email every time before she is sending. With a priority, of course, so that if she doesn't have much time, then she can check the most important things. Like, is the message clear, and does the person understand what I need from them, for example. And she could try this out to see if it helps, both with the worry and with writing the emails well. So in this way, in a very small everyday matter, thinking in terms of success, mastery, and perfection can change our point of view of how we approach something, right? And I really like this example because several people saw this and said, oh yes, we also do the same. Like, this is writing perfect emails is a bit of a headache, especially if it's an important email. If I have to like give it a visual, this is what mastery and perfection look like in my head. So mastery is more outward. It's more about seeing opportunities. It's about reaching out to people, making new connections, and it's going forward in the outer world. There is this openness I feel when I am pursuing mastery. If I am pursuing perfection, it feels more boxed in and more inward focused. So I am more afraid of making a mistake, and it's a very narrow path usually. So it's more about attention on myself rather than on the task or the thing that I'm trying to do or learn well, for example. And pursuing mastery, finally, I feel opens our minds. Because on the way to mastery, we are led by bigger goals than just avoiding failure, which can happen when we are pursuing success or when we are pursuing perfection, for example. So this is also interesting that it changes the focus of what you are pursuing. And this quote is also from Sarah Lewis, came up with this whole concept. So if you want to look at perfection and mastery in your life, then here is some homework for you. Think of an area in your life where you pursue perfection or are afraid of failure. And think, what does success look like for you in this area? And what would it look like or feel like if you were trying to gain mastery in this area? So I'll just give you a moment to absorb this in case you want to take this along for homework. So with this, we are at the end of the talk, and I would like to do a short recap. I am trying to see if we have time for this. So if you could type in the chat the top one thing or an aha moment you had from the talk. This is to consolidate your learning, because when we repeat things, our brain remembers them better. So at least one thing you want to remember or take away from this, write it down in the chat. It would also be interesting for me to see what you take away or how you experience what you learned here. If you do user research and want to learn more on creativity, there's also, I'm giving a webinar this week and also next week. There are 3 slots to know and grow your creative self. You are welcome to join. I'll put this link in the chat, or I think you'll get a copy of this presentation as well. So you're welcome to join it. And thank you so much for giving me your time. I really appreciate it. And I am open for questions.
Thank you very much, Beyond. That was very, very insightful. I was particularly intrigued by the part that you said, if you want to know what's your reaction to failure, or what's your team or organization's reaction, then ask yourself, what will happen, or what do people do when something goes wrong? Do they ask whose fault it was, or do they basically close off? And also love the fact that you mentioned that with more experience and more confidence in your skills, then you became more open to failure as well. I think that's very relatable. I'm gonna start off the questions while people are typing in the chat about their learnings. So now that you have researched failure and how it works and looked at it from different angles, is it possible to lose your fear of failure at all? Or do you have any tips for us?
So I wish I could just say yes, you do. But at least, because I think it's my duty to also be honest, this is as far as I have come, that I am learning to walk with failure. So that's one thing, that you learn that the fear of failure is not the truth of life. As in, what I'm afraid of is not the only thing that matters. So I think that's one thing that you learn. when you start paying attention to this, because you also realize that yes, this fear is important, that addresses the need for safety, but we have other needs, like we have curiosity, we want engagement in life, we want connection with people, and for all that, you need to look at your fear and go like, yes, but I also want these other things in life. So that's one thing, that if you look at fear of failure, I don't know if you get rid of it, but you definitely start to lead a richer life, I feel.
Yeah,
And the
definitely.
second part is, sorry, you were saying?
No, I was just saying definitely. That makes a lot of sense.
And the second part is, I think in some things, you do, like, the threshold for fear becomes higher. Like once you've done something and you've lived through something once, the next time it's less scary. So you may not lose it entirely, because fear is a very inherent emotion to us and it's very useful. So you may not lose it entirely, but it starts showing up at the littlest of, like public embarrassment or not being perceived an expert doesn't seem that big a deal once you've already gone through this process of, like, oh, I did fail at, being perceived as an expert once. So, might as well, like, it didn't kill me, so I can try it again, right? So it does make the threshold for feeling afraid higher. So you find it easier to step into a lot of new things. I think these are the two things I would say.
Beautiful, very helpful. I'm seeing in the chat that people are sharing their quotes from your presentation or their aha moments. I'm going to read some of them. I wish someone would have taught this at school when we were young. I agree with that. And they love the concept of success, mastery, perfection, great input on how to embrace failure in a team. And there's also a question. It's kind of related to failure, kind of related to research. So, what do you think is the best way to get a good user hearing when we are under the time pressure of a project?
Could you say that again?
Yes, of course. What do you think is the best way to get a good user hearing when we are under the time pressure of a project?
A good user hearing. Um, does that mean like getting feedback, or does it mean listen? Because I'm not sure what do they mean when they say good user hearing.
I'm guessing user input.
Okay. I think like that's like $1 million question these days, right? Like, how do we do user research even when we have zero time? Um, so of course there are like many agile ways and so on and so forth. But this is one place where I think processes can help a lot, because I must say that there were in the beginning of my career, like around 10 years ago, the question was, how do we make time for doing user research? Because nobody had planned it in, right? But I saw as businesses got more mature, at least the businesses that did learn from their previous failures of not learning from the users, they started to plan it in. And then the question is not about how do we make time for this. The question is, when are we doing this? Who is doing this? What's the best way to do it? So I think in this case, uh, it's actually about planning and process rather than, because yes, if all important things we make time for them in life, no? If we don't make time for this, that means it's not important to the business. So that's how I have experienced it, at least. I
Yeah,
don't know if
and
that answers your question. Sorry.
no, I think that makes sense. And looking at the comments, I think the concept of mastery has resonated with a lot of people listening in. One Federico says top code mastery moves outwards while perfectionism is inward focused and limiting. So on that topic, when do you know you have reached mastery? Or is that possible at all? What does that look like?
So I think that was really nice to realize as well, that if you look at masters of anything, when they talk about X is a master, Y is a master, they are actually defining somebody who moved the field forward. So they didn't reach the end of a field. They found new opportunities within a field, right? So it's like a never-ending process, and that's what I like about mastery, that you could pursue it in really little things and forever, be in this playground kind of, rather than, being desperate to reach a destination of some kind.
Yep, and there's another question. So Federico is saying that sometimes when you show an early draft and get feedback, then the result is that people think that's the best result you could get. And that leaves a negative impression. So how do you deal with that?
So
His point is that people are not used to give feedback on early drafts.
yes, so I can imagine, and I think this has to do with partly with the work culture, but also with the way of working. So I would say either one thing is you could try to educate people on the way of working, and embracing this way of working, where you share very early work so that you kind of build failure into the process. Or if that's not possible, because I know there are limitations of our work environments, and sometimes you cannot change the whole organization, you could get feedback from people you feel safe with. So often I get feedback from people who actually are friends or family, and who are kind enough to listen to all sorts of rambling, even those that are related to user research and they have nothing to do with user research. But I always see that my projects get better even when I'm talking to somebody who has actually, they get better because I'm talking to people who have nothing to do with user research, because the questions they ask are the kind of questions your stakeholders are going to ask who don't do user research. Um, so I would say maybe then get feedback from people you feel safe with, and then actively build, a few buddies you can ask from as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if I can also share something from my experience, is that setting the scene is also very important at the beginning. Saying that this is an early draft, and kind of manage the expectations that way. Thank you so much. We learned a lot, and it's very apparent from the comments as well. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us. And please follow Beyond. All right. Next, we have Hester. But I just want to quickly mention that stick with us, because we have another talk after Hester as well. We are going to see very inspiring and award-winning data visualizations from Jan, and he's going to take us through his process for data visualization or creative data visualization. So don't go anywhere, stick around. But our next speaker is wonderful Hester. She is also a senior researcher with years of experience working with big techs and startups, and I've had the pleasure to know her closely, and I have worked with her in the past as well. It's always very inspiring for me to see how much care and innovation she puts in her work. She is currently working with Status.im, which is a fully remote company defining the future of decentralized web with worthy principles like privacy. You should check them out. I think they are hiring for a remote senior product designer at the moment.
Yes, we are.
Good. And today she is taking us through a cross-country research project she conducted on blockchain and cryptocurrency. Take it away, Hester.
Thank you, Pesa. And I must say, it's I feel fortunate for being able to follow up on Beyan's presentation, because I get to fully embrace my fear of failure before presenting, and actually had the chance to take a moment and set an intention. So thank you for that, Beyan. Yeah, so tidbits of UX research in crypto. A brief introduction about myself. Yes, I'm a UX researcher. I'm a team lead of a design team. I occasionally do some designs myself, but I'm happy to work with people who are way better at design than I am. One thing that I thought might not shine through in the bio I shared ahead of this talk is that I used to work for ING, and actually signed the banker's oath back in 2015 when it was introduced. And coincidentally, that was also around the same time that I started to take an interest in Bitcoin, blockchain, later on Ethereum. So you could say that somehow I ended up changing, switching teams, working for a different type of bank now, a decentralized bank where you can sort of, in a way, be your own bank. After I took an interest in Bitcoin blockchain initially, I started learning a little bit more about Ethereum, and that's how I ended up at Status as a UX researcher. And I know my talk said something about crypto, and honestly, if it comes to like setting intentions and my intention being that I want to share a specific story, a specific direction, I don't want to talk too much about crypto. It might creep in here and there. I actually do want to talk a lot more about the web. Web has gone through an evolution I think is quite familiar to all of us, where we used to have this web that was only kind of like information sharing, right? And you could read that information, going to allowing anyone to read and write, posting information, like sharing your life on Facebook, sharing your home on Airbnb and things like that. A lot has changed when we moved to Web 2.0, which I suppose have been around for about 15, 20 years by now. And what I'm particularly interested in is this concept of Web3. If you look at Wikipedia, which is where you go if you want to look for a definition when preparing a presentation, if you go to Wikipedia, there's actually not too much on Web3. It's a little more than a side note on the topic of semantic web, which was introduced years ago, but never seems to have really taken on that defining role for Web3. So yeah, it's still a little bit vague, a little bit undefined. So I was thinking, like, what do you do when Wikipedia doesn't give you a definition? Ask Twitter. So I went on Twitter and I looked at what are the things that come up when I search for Web3 on Twitter. Definitely a little bit biased because Twitter algorithms and my personal bubble. But some of the things that come up when I look into Web3 are cryptocurrency, blockchain, decentralization, NFT, Doge, DeFi, and a lot of other new lingo, new unfamiliar words come up. So there was kind of a first step into kind of understanding like how would Web3 be defined, and there's obviously some definitions out there. Another thing that happens when you actually then dive into that rabbit hole or start to like read more about cryptocurrency, some other things pop up, which is rats, kitties, and a lot of dogs. Actually, a lot of dogs. Doge, sheep, less of Shiba Inus, especially the ones going to the moon, because that's what every cryptocurrency is supposed to do, go to the moon in terms of value. You find a lot of references to Lambos. When are you going to get enough money to buy your Lambo, your Lamborghini? And you got a lot of food references, a lot of unicorns and a lot of food. So sushi, yam, all things like that. More unicorns, you get bunny-shaped pancakes. And this is then supposed to be this new web. It all sounds a little bit silly. It all sounds a little bit like, why would anyone want to invest any time in that? It seems superficial, let's put it like that. And it seems a little bit difficult to understand or grasp why anyone would take an interest in that. Almost in a way that it seemed silly to start thinking about an internet and what an internet could mean to people. So this is kind of why I want to share some stories. This whole Web3 notion and cryptocurrency notion comes with its connotations that are perhaps a little bit superficial. And as a UX researcher, I've actually spent the last 3.5 years trying to understand what then drives adoption for cryptocurrency and related technologies, underlying technologies. Some of these stories, I think, pose an answer. And then there's always a lot more questions that they call on, right? So to start off with a first story, back in November of 2018, me and research colleagues over at Status, we visited South Korea. We visited Seoul. And one of the main reasons that we visited, specifically South Korea, had to do with the kimchi, what's called the kimchi premium. Another one of those fun crypto-related terms. Excuse me. Kimchi premium is actually something that's cropping up again, and it refers to the demand for particular currencies being so high in South Korea that like, relatively speaking, Bitcoin's more expensive to get there at an exchange than anywhere else in the world, right? So we wanted to understand why is that? Why it's particularly in South Korea is cryptocurrency going through such a boom, such a hype, and we see that happening now again. When we were there, we visited people at home, we talked to a local research partner, and we started to get this understanding that it's actually about a lot more than quick profit or making money. There's a whole socioeconomic system behind this drive to buy cryptocurrencies. One of the kind of it's a combination of factors, but one of the things that stood out is this idea of younger generations simply wanting to leave the house. And this is where it gets a little bit more complicated. It's not easy to leave the house, and with that I mean your parental home. It's not easy to leave that home. Reason being is that it is very expensive. The housing market is extremely expensive. It's very expensive to find your own place. Outside of work, there are very little types of investments that can actually help you kind of raise the capital that you would need. The stock market is biased towards business investors, not too friendly to retail investors. So it's kind of difficult to get like permission for certain types of trading. And then on top of that, there's a lot of social pressure. There's a whole generation that grew up with their parents kind of living through what they call the miracle of Han, having reestablished such a like prosperous economy in such a short amount of time that there's this very strong sense of obligation that like you shouldn't go for seeking ways to leave the house. What you should go for is help build that economy, go work for Samsung, right? So there's a lot of social pressure around it as well, which combined then seem to lead to this like pool of crypto, making it a lot more interesting in South Korea than other countries. And I try to kind of relate back some of the principles behind especially permissionless blockchain technology to understand why is it that particularly crypto then would offer a solution, right? Which again, one of the reasons being that it's permissionless. Well, it's very difficult to get onto the stock market and being a retailer, make a good profit there. Within this crypto world of Web3, anyone can do anything. So it's actually much easier to get started. Similarly, you don't need a lot of capital to get started, which is a barrier. I might get back to that later as well. Wealth creates wealth, and if you don't have a lot to start from, it's very difficult to start investing in most cases. In crypto, you need a few dollars and your phone, and that's about it, right? Moving forward from Seoul in South Korea, we then actually kind of went on a tour through Asia to China. And in China, I met a ambassador, a community manager for Status, and he shared an interesting story with me. There's a video. I'm not sure if you can hear the audio, but here's, in any case, the video. Worst case, you miss out on the wonderful music in the background. And so I can imagine that you're wondering here, what the hell am I looking at, right? Not sure if I can pause it. So SNT is the network currency that Status as a product, as a network, uses. And in this video, someone is sharing a package that has been sent in exchange for SNT. So what the community manager, Stephen, explained to me was that actually there's this whole active community, Chinese community, which obviously I couldn't read too much about their conversations, that was setting up a marketplace with the first person to sort of initiate that marketplace, offering mushrooms that were in the end sold for about 200,000 SNT. I think it was about $9 at the time. Not magic mushrooms, no illegal mushrooms, but very special mountain mushrooms. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with kind of the food culture in China. There's a lot that has been said about that, but definitely there's always this strive for finding like the unique, special delicacy that's difficult to come by, and these mushrooms were one of them. So thinking again, like what makes it about this idea of cryptocurrency and more broadly Web3 that is interesting to use if you just want to sell a special type of mushrooms to someone else. Next, yeah. So one of the reasons that makes a permissionless blockchain or any blockchain interesting is that it's what's referred to as trustless. It's supposed to be trustless. Of course, you have to trust the technology, you have to trust the validators, the contracts, the auditors. There's a lot of people you have to trust along the way. But once you're using a somewhat mature product, you can exchange value with anyone, whether it's mushrooms for SNT or something else, with no intermediaries, right? This person didn't have to go on Etsy and Etsy like claiming some commission to act as a trusted party in between in order to sell these mushrooms. So that's an interesting aspect that would drive to use a particular blockchain. The other thing is that it's public, right? And that leads into it being trustless. You can see exactly when a transaction's been made. So you can see exactly when it's a good time for you actually to go and send that package. And then lastly, actually, I think I might have one more item here. One thing that's very interesting is that your identity on a blockchain is like it's a string of like letters and numbers. Like it's really not much more than that. You're an address. Your identity is an address, and that makes you pseudo-anonymous. Especially in some countries like China or anywhere where you would have reason to protect your identity from being connected to some activities, whether illegal or immoral. Being pseudo-anonymous has its benefits there. And then the last one, I think particularly relevant in China, where status as a product was used, is that a blockchain, a permissionless blockchain, becomes in a way censorship resistant as long as there are enough people participating in a network to validate what transactions happen or to validate, or let's say to relay messages if it's about a messaging network that Status works on. If you have enough people acting as a node, as a validator or a relayer in that network, it becomes very difficult to shut down. You can shut down maybe the power on one party, but if there's like hundreds of thousands left, what do you do, right? So that's also considered one of the benefits there. And then what kind of happened was they ended up making a very happy, healthy mushroom meal. Again, not magic mushrooms. So moving from China to Venezuela, other part of the world in South America, very different type of use case. This is probably a well-known fact. Venezuela hit hyperinflation for various reasons. It's also an embargoed country. Dollars or doing business with American companies not allowed. Dollars were for a long time banned from by the government of Venezuela itself. This is, in the picture, you see a participant that we talked to that is the partner of someone who actually migrated. About 5.2 million people migrated Venezuela, which is a lot for a country of, I believe, 30 million people. Her partner, as I recall, is in Colombia or Chile, and sends funds back to her so she can support herself and their baby. Crypto transactions are a very common method among people in similar situations to the woman we talked to share funds cross-border. The remittance market is an incredibly big, profitable market, but it's also very costly for individuals to send remittances across borders. So again, I'm not sure if you can hear any audio. I don't speak Spanish either. This is my colleague explaining how people in a similar situation actually do send crypto funds back and forth to each other using an application. So that's a very, very common use case. There's actually been a connection between Bitcoin blockchain transactions and a power outage in Venezuela, where you can clearly see a drop in activity when there's a power outage in Venezuela, which only points to kind of behind the scenes how intensely that is being used. Another example from Venezuela, and I find this one of the most striking images. There are loads of images that you can find online, and we took some similar pictures while we were there, that shows Bolivar being used as almost as toilet paper, being worthless. Like there's really, you might as well burn it and have something to watch, right? And what I think is striking is this kind of image of one of the larger stores run by the government where you buy diapers by the piece, right? When you get to the point that you have to calculate if you can afford a diaper for your baby by the piece, that's hyperinflation. What we've seen a lot of people do in that scenario is that they look for a store of value, because the money that you earn one day might be completely worthless the next day. So this is where Bitcoin especially is appreciated. Obviously, getting funds on Bitcoin, out of Bitcoin, there's a lot of hassle and cost involved there as well. But if you have no stable currency of your own nation, if you have no access to a stable currency of another nation because you're embargoed, that is the direction that people seem to tend to go to. Comparing a little bit here, Bitcoin blockchain versus Ethereum blockchain, which are some of the two major chains. There's also the concept of just being programmable money, that you like programmable contracts that run on these chains, which allow to create stable coins, whether these are then pegged to a stable fiat currency. So if you can't access dollars, you might like access a stable coin that is pegged to a dollar, same value, or that's in some other way algorithmically stabilized based on demand. So these are some of the ways in which cryptocurrencies offer relief in those scenarios. Passing again to a different continent, to Africa, Nigeria. Unfortunately, no in-person research there, COVID and all. So we ended up running a survey to understand what drives crypto adoption in Nigeria. There's been a publication by Statista earlier this year about the global research that said 35 respondents from Nigeria reported that they own and use cryptocurrency. Probably don't have to tell this audience, but statistics, there's a lot to say about like 35% really. But it is high compared to other countries, and that was very interesting to us, and also to investigate for ourselves what's happening there. Some of the draws there is not necessarily like this idea of censorship resistance. It's this idea of being able to access wealth to begin with. And this is what I mentioned a moment ago, wealth creates wealth. There are a lot of people who don't have that wealth to begin with, that are therefore locked out of investment and opportunities to grow in prosperity. So what a lot of people in Nigeria end up doing is using what's called DeFi, decentralized finance, which again is this permissionless access. All you need is a phone and accessing an application and a few dollars to start from. And that's where this quote comes from. I have used my cake to farm other tokens on PancakeSwap. All sounds a bit surreal. I think people are definitely like looking for ways to make this technology sound and seem approachable. But essentially, it says I went on to a dApp and I provided liquidity. I offered some of my tokens of one type as an investment to earn interest, and thereby kind of increase my own wealth. So again, DeFi services are key in Nigeria, it seems. One last example, and then I suppose I should start wrapping up as well. This occurred last week when I was preparing for this talk. I figured, like, what other examples are there out there? And then I reassured myself, thinking, oh gosh, there's something new crops up in this world every other week or so. And so yes, last week this transaction happened. And if you look a few rows down, you can see they're from VB, which is from Vitalik Buterin, the author and one of the founders of Ethereum Foundation, author of the Ethereum white paper, who sent Shiba Inu SHIB to a COVID relief fund in India. Now, there's a lot to say about like the actual value here. It was valued at $1 billion at the time. If there's no liquidity, it doesn't necessarily mean that much. What it does show, though, is this use case of tracking donations. This fund, India COVID Crypto Fund, receives all its funds in cryptocurrency, and so you can track exactly where that money goes, to what other addresses it might be sent. And that's one of the cases that makes this technology in some scenarios just very beneficial. So, and then I'll wrap up. A common thought around cryptocurrency, especially when you say like permissionless and censorship resistance, is that's shady, that allows for a lot of illegal activity to happen. And I think we all know that the shady activities happen regardless. One last example I would want to share is getting a national fiat currency. When going to Venezuela, we were recommended get dollars, get lots of dollars, make sure they're like the notes don't have any what do you call it, crevices, that they look like shiny and new, that gives them the most value to get a lot of dollars. So that's what we did. We went to multiple ATMs to get enough dollars, actually enough Colombian pesos to then go to an exchange and exchange those for dollars. So we had this whole stack of dollars to bring. This is a result of what I got after that. So with the dollars that I brought, when you then enter Venezuela, yes, dollars are useful, but there's also a whole market where you still need Bolivar. ATMs are empty. You can go to an ATM. Citizens can go to their branch of their bank, where they can get, maybe on like good days, the amount that is the equivalent of like a bunch of bananas, not more than that. And they're only allowed to go once a day. So yes, Bolivar as a currency is still required. At the same time, it's so hard to come by. So what we ended up doing was going to like an illegal money dealer to exchange those dollars for Bolivar. Illegal, one, because of the exchange, because it's an illegal exchange that the government doesn't earn any money on. And number two, because it was very likely drug money, as the seller informed us. So shady, there's a lot of things that can be shady, not necessarily immoral. There's one thing I would want to leave you with is, if you see a lot of dogs and cats when you read about crypto, or a lot of Elon Musk pictures going to the moon, yeah, please also know there's a whole global community out there that beyond the cryptocurrency is building this new type of web, this Web3. And there are also a lot of people that benefit from some of the services, or benefit from this the technology, and for them it does serve a real purpose. So that's what I wanted to leave you with. Yeah, again, my name is Hester. I work for Status. Please join me there. You can find me on Status, similar to checking out Twitter. You'll be linked to install the application, and then it's easy to start a chat. So I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Hester. That was fascinating. And it's really interesting that the specific characteristics of Web3 and cryptocurrency, like low entry barrier, trustless, no identity, censorship resistant, make it really possible for people to appropriate it based on their context and their needs. And it makes up for really interesting cases and unexpected cases. So I'm going to encourage people to share their learnings or questions in the chat. And while they'll do that, I'm going to ask you a question about blockchains in general. So there's a common discussion in that primary blockchains like Bitcoin, Ethereum use a technology that costs a lot of energy. And so it's a fair question here to ask, are the benefits worth it? Also considering the environmental impact, or do you think that will change in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely a fair question, and I think it's debated about it like every single day in the space. There's a lot of views on it. One thing that I would say is that most people do agree that it is a problem that needs fixing, right? So there's definitely not a lot of climate change deniers in the space, if you will. So given the impact that I've seen personally, pretty like far-reaching in terms of like the effect it has on people's personal life, being able to do things that otherwise you would not. Just this week, I was talking to a colleague in the space who like really got into trouble because he couldn't get a loan. That type of story might not reach us every day, but it happens a lot. So like in my view, this transition of power, like going like whether it's financially or in terms of governance, this transition of power that the technology enables is pretty impactful. Not to say that then climate is not a concern, but I'd rather than focus on how are we going to solve that problem. There are a lot of efforts going into switching between different consensus mechanisms, if you will. Going from proof of work to proof of stake, all of that is going to take time. So if you think about any modern company going through digital transformation, I don't know, it was maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, every large company was going through digital transformation. And yes, that takes a couple of years. This is like $1 billion, like an application that, multiple applications that have tons and tons of value in it. So it's going to take time. But I am definitely optimistic about the developments that I'm seeing. And I also know, like, more close by that Status is working on making light clients, so light validators that actually run on devices that don't need a lot of power, like the Raspberry Pi. Then, just to add to that, there are, if you think about Web3 as the broader concept, there are so many applications that you can think of that do not necessarily require the security properties or the energy use that the blockchain itself does, that you can still use, like messaging.
Yeah, nice. Thank you for that. And you mentioned that, Web3 there is a whole community around it and defining it beyond cryptocurrency, of course. And you're working Status, whose mission is actually defining this future. So I'm curious, what aspect of this new technology interests or excites you the most?
This what aspect? So I go in between. I'm not too much of a financial aspect expert. So the whole decentralized finance movement hasn't really meant too much to me. But if I then hear about the personal examples close by of people saying, well, actually, because of these services, I was actually able to get a loan or able to access credit that otherwise I really wouldn't have access to. So I find that very, very promising. Plus, and this is something on the other side of like Web3, I think we all know the complexity and challenges of social media companies. One of the challenges also being that they are centralized companies that have a lot to say. And their decision power is based on economic incentives. That doesn't necessarily result in best decisions for any news that we get, any governance that is the result from that. Especially the products that Status is building is targeting also that area of Web3. So bringing more control to individuals rather than an economically incentivized large corporation to make those decisions.
Yeah, very powerful indeed. So there is a question in the chat. As a designer, given the drastic changes in the technology, how can we make more informed decisions about the digital transformation of crypto products?
I'm just absorbing the question. So is this about digital transformation? This is what I'm wondering, thinking out loud. Is this about the digital transformation to crypto products or the impact it would have for designers? So if so, I think one of the ways to make more informed decisions, and I think I've said this again, different forums, is to start spending at least 50% of our time focused on the technology and don't take an answer for granted that, yes, we use this single sign-on service because that's easy, we have an API for it, but to actually start learning about how some of the building blocks work, because that's where a lot of the incentives come from. That's why, or when Amazon Web Servers are used instead of another solution that might also serve the same purpose. Especially like over the last 3 years, 3.5 years, I've kind of been forced to learn a lot in depth about how the technology works. And I'm definitely not there like learning something new every day, but it shifts perspectives about what can be done. And I think that's very critical for more designers to understand that some of the proposals we make, some of the underlying technology we use is at fault here, and it can be changed.
Yeah, and I guess not taking no for an answer sometimes, because sometimes we think that that's not possible, but when you dig into it, maybe it is possible technologically speaking.
And join the design community on Status. Send me a message. I think just being connected to that community and other communities that are more tech driven or finding a closer connection to engineering definitely helps here.
Thank you so much. That was, I think, all of the questions in the chat. Thank you again for sharing your experiences and really these fascinating stories with us. It was eye-opening.
Thank you, Parisa.
All right. Next, we have a talk from Jan Willem. Let me just quickly check something. Yep. So hi, Jan. I first met Jan when I attended a talk he was giving. And I remember very distinctly that I was being awe-inspired by his data visualization designs. I find his work specifically very relevant to the world we are living in today because data is abundant and everywhere, but it's not always easy for everyone to make sense of it. And Jan's visualizations bridges that gap very nicely and democratizes data. He's also working on an upcoming online class on the art of data visualization design. So follow him to be updated about the class and when that's available if you're interested. Today, he's taking us through his process. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me make my screen big. So you see everything? So yeah, my name is Jan Willem Tulp. I'm a data experience designer and I create creative data visualizations. And today I want to talk about from data to visualization with intent. And I want to start with a bar chart because I think what I'm going to tell about creative data visualization, it does not necessarily mean that a bar chart does not have intent. I think the designer of this bar chart has made clear decisions about which data to show, how to show it, the ordering of the values, titles, and things like that. So there's definitely intent here. And a bar chart works really well because we as humans, we are very good at seeing the differences in lengths of the rectangles in this case. So it's very effective. And if you would break down this bar chart, you would see on the vertical axis, you would see country labels. So that's a categorical scale. And you have on the horizontal axis, you have the expression of, in this case, the value for life expectancy represented by the length of the bar. So we have one quantitative value dimension, the life expectancy, and one categorical value. And that's basically the recipe for a bar chart. So every time you run into a situation where you need one categorical value and one quantitative value, you can create a bar chart. So this is actually all good news because you have many situations where this is the case, and also it's a very effective way of showing data. And since people are using this all the time, people are very familiar with it. So it's all good, actually. So I don't have any complaints about a bar chart in that sense. However, at the same time, the downside is that everybody uses them and they all look the same. And maybe you don't remember a specific bar chart because they all look the same, or you were not that engaged with a bar chart. Because they all look the same, and it's kind of a single recipe for all situations. Another thing that it doesn't really do is, because it works for all situations, it's not specific for a particular situation. So it doesn't tell you anything about the ideas behind the data that it shows. And that's basically what I think is creative data visualization design. So it's not just looking at what data types do I have. Do I have categorical, quantitative, or ordinal data dimensions in my data set? And how can I map that to visual properties? That's already a very good thing. But I think creative data visualization design, when you do that, you try to think a little bit further than that. And that's what I'm going to show today. Because as mentioned, I'm working on an online course, the art of creative data visualization design. And I must say that it has been quite a challenge for me because I've been doing this work for almost 10 years now, and it's really intuitive for me. And I keep lots of things in my mind while working on visualization projects. So what I've been trying to do is write down all the things that all the questions that I ask myself and all the things that I do, and I try to turn that into some kind of framework. And that framework is the thing that I would like to share with you, because I think it's interesting, even if you're not in the course. So what you see right here is, I think, kind of a general communication model. If you want to communicate something, you might create a communication artifact or design, and then there's an audience and they interpret your design. And this communication artifact can be anything. It can be a song, a painting, a news item, an advertisement, website, anything, graphic design. It's just the thing that you use to communicate something. Now, when you actually make a design, it's usually a very good thing not only to create it, but also to take a step back and try to pretend your target audience. And look at your design and see what it means. And does it really communicate the thing that you have in mind? Does it facilitate the type of interpretation that you have in mind? And or are there things that don't work really well? Do they need improvement? So besides skills of showing data, you also need skills of seeing data in your design. There's another reason why this is very important, because you can do user testing, of course, but in my experience, creating a data visualization is a very evolutionary process. In the beginning, you usually do not know what the end result will be. So you constantly improve your design. And I think it's not very efficient and realistic to expect that there's someone right beside you and judging your design for every step. So you have to have this skill yourself as well. And there's another reason for some public-facing projects, there may not even be your target user or target audience available for testing. So I've done quite a few projects where, of course, there are maybe a client or a scientist who knows about the data, or other people who can have a say about it. But I've done quite a few projects where I didn't do any testing with the end user, simply because, well, sometimes you work on a project and you don't want to reveal it yet, or things like that. So it's quite common to not do any actual user testing with end users. So the first thing is every project has a context. And with that, I mean constraints and requirements. And you might say that requirements could be considered constraints as well, but kind of self-imposed constraints. If you have a requirement at a high abstraction level, you can think of the goal of a project. Something like, we want you to design something where users can learn about this topic, or something like that. That's a high-level goal. Sometimes it can also be very specific. We want you to create a visualization, and it needs to be shown on our corporate website. So the colors that you use have to be as much as possible from our corporate design style. That's a very specific requirement. And there are also constraints, like we want you to create a visualization and it's going to be on print. Now, that, for instance, means that you probably will not consider interactivity. You might maybe consider folding paper or doing something creative with that. But I think for most situations, when you create something for print, interactivity is, for instance, out of the question. So the general context of your project already gives you, well, at least some general direction and sometimes some specific details of what you should be doing. Then the next thing is the data itself. And there always has to be data for a data visualization. There's no data visualization without data. And data is something I think is quite special, because we as humans, we can navigate the world around us. We can manipulate it, interact with it. But we can only do that within the world directly around us. But there are lots of things that are too big or too small, too fast or invisible or abstract concepts. And those are things we cannot experience or perceive. So what we then do is we collect data about this so that we can, in a kind of an indirect way, enjoy or experience or learn from things that we otherwise would not be able to do. So when I think of data, I think of something like this. You're having dinner with a friend of yours and you take a picture of your food. As this picture is the actual data point, but the food in front of you is the real world. And those two completely different things. This picture is really a moment in time from a certain angle with a certain lighting, and that's it. But the food, you can taste it, you can smell it, you can move it, you can touch it, you can eat it, you can leave it there, and then it changes. So these are completely different things. If that would be a data point, this would be a data set. And here you might say, this is a guy doing a backflip. But if you look closely, it's actually not a guy doing a backflip. It's multiple pictures of a guy doing a backflip. And that's basically how data sets work. So we have not just one data point, but we have lots of data points. And by combining them, we try to look for trends or structure or patterns or things like that. But you have to realize, just with the picture of your food, in this picture, there are also a lot of decisions involved. So who's the model going to be? How many pictures am I going to take? What's the lighting going to be? What's my position going to be? And this is true for every data set. The data set is always a simplified abstraction of the real world, where there are always decisions, maybe conscious, maybe unconscious, but there are always decisions involved. And this means that your data is kind of a limited representation of the world around us. And one thing that I think is not sometimes considered, but not often enough, let's put it that way, is what I would call non-data. Because your data represents something, but this something is more than is being captured with your data. And it's not metadata, which is data about data, but non-data is kind of properties and concepts and ideas about the topic that your data is about. So for instance, if you have a data set that is about the number of trees planted in a year or something, your data set might have a column with a number for each month or each location, and that's the number of trees planted. And that's what is in your data set. But what's not in your data set is that it's about trees. Trees are living things. They grow, they die, they have branches, they change during seasons, the leaves are green. These are all kinds of properties about the thing that you are visualizing that is not part of your data, but could be something that could influence your design. And that is where you might see some designs where they use visual metaphors, and that's where that comes from. But it's not only for used for visual representation. It might also be something that you could use to structure your data, or the way that you explain your data or something. It is really important to consider non-data as well. And here's an example project. I hope that you can see the video. This is a side project I did a few years ago, and it's a representation of 24 hours of train data in the Netherlands. Now, what you see is that the cities are constantly moving. The orange dots are trains moving between cities, but the white dots are cities, and they move. Now, the thing is that this visualization is based, the entire concept is based on non-data, because I had this idea that I was thinking about, so what does it mean if a train moves from one city to another city? And the idea that I had was, conceptually, it moves one city closer to another city. And I don't know if this makes sense or not, maybe not at all, but at least it was the concept I was working with. And that was the concept I also implemented. So cities actually move closer on the screen when there are trains moving between cities. And since there are multiple trains leaving from a city at a certain moment, so cities move all around. And I would expect that during the day, the west of the Netherlands, where there are much more trains, would contract, and then in the evening they would open up again. And that's kind of what happens. And it's also, I would say, valuable to do these kind of experimental projects, because, yeah, obviously it's a side project. There's no real client and a real goal for this project. It was just a fun idea I wanted to explore. But it led to another project, which I will show later. And it's also currently part of the permanent exhibition of Ars Electronica in Austria. So doing these kind of side projects where you do creative experiments is highly recommended, I would say. There's another thing that has an influence on your design, and that's your audience. And it's not, your audience is of course interpreting your design, and an obvious thing is to consider is what is the data literacy of your audience, and what is the visual literacy of your audience. And that might mean that you might need to provide a certain level of guidance to guide your audience through visualization. That is one thing, and that's maybe should be obvious, I would say. But there's another thing, and that is your audience are humans. And humans are good at some things and not so good at other things. And if you look at data, sometimes in your data you see that there are big numbers. And one thing that people don't have an intuitive sense of is big numbers. And if you look around on the internet, you see that designers sometimes translate big numbers to different kind of concepts or units. So 1,000 kilometers, how many soccer fields is that, or something like that? So that, well, you can imagine a soccer field, so then you should be able to imagine 1,000 kilometers or something like that. So translating units to something that is more intuitive is one thing that you could do. And that's another example. This is, again, a side project I did at the end of last year. And it's called COVID spreading rates. I took this screen recording this morning, and it's based on data from Our World in Data. And when I created it, it was just countries, but apparently they also included a region, so it's not entirely correct anymore. But anyway, the reason behind this project was that by the end of last year, the focus was more on the number of new cases instead of vaccinations, which is the current focus more, at least in Western countries. And I would say that in all the news outlets, you would see there are 500 new cases in this country, 200 in that one, 1,500 in that one, etc. So, of course, you can say, well, that country has much more than that country, and even, well, 100 cases, 200 cases. You can rationally compare those numbers, but do you have a feeling with how much more is 200 compared to 100, or 1,500 to 2,000? How does it really compare? Do you have a sense of it? Yeah, you can say one is more than the other, but how much more? And so what I did right here is I translated these big numbers to the number of cases per second. And so basically what I did, I created a kind of real-time simulation. And so in real time, you see how many new cases there are in each country. And so the visualization itself is not very revolutionary. It's kind of a radial progress bar or something. But the idea to show data per second, that is a really different approach to showing how many new cases are reported every second. And so you can really get a sense of, now there's a new case, now there's another one, now there's another one, and for that other country it could be now. And that's something you can experience right now. And so these types of visualization where they try to turn concepts or data into something you can experience directly, yeah, it's what I would call direct experience type of visualization. And this would be one example of it. The final component of this framework is you. Obviously, you are creating the design. So yeah, just like with data, you are already present in the design because you make all the decisions on what to show, which data to show, etc. So you're already part of it. But there's more that could be part of the design. Because maybe you have an opinion about your design. Maybe you have want to make an argument, or maybe you have some emotional ideas about it. Maybe you think it's a very sad story. So would a bar chart with blue bars, just like every other bar chart, communicate the fact that you find this a sad story? Probably not. So maybe you have to come up with another way to communicate the fact that this is a sad story. So again, it also makes it more relatable, but it also involves including your own ideas. And it can also include having your own ideas with regards to design. sometimes you have the opportunity, if the constraints of your project allow this, to come up with well, really creative approaches of showing data. And that is the project that I want to show next. And this is the follow-up project of the first project that I showed. And this is for the Dutch railways. And it's, again, 24 hours of train data in the Netherlands. And here you can select a country, or a city, I mean, and then you see all the trains that that pass that city at a certain moment in time during the day. And what's happening is that when a train moves, it leaves a trail. Now, if you would consider this to be a two-dimensional map, you could think of it leaves a two-dimensional trail, so it leaves the track. But in this case, the time is moving as well. So it leaves the trace, but the time is moving in a circle. And it's moving in a circle because it's 24 hours, it's a day, and after that it starts repeating itself. So this circle concept makes sense. So when you see the map, you see all the cities, and you see the trail each train leaves behind the map, and then you can switch to the 24-hour view, and then you see 24 hours of train data. And in this case, the color represents how busy it is. And so every city has its own kind of unique characteristic or shape, or whatever you want to call it. And now in this project, I was able to create a design like this because the idea was that this was used on the website where they published the annual report. And the idea is annual reports are boring. So they thought, well, maybe we should create something that is a little bit more engaging so that people would enjoy at least coming to this website. And that's the purpose of this visualization. So I was given quite a bit of freedom to come up with my own approach. And as you can see, it still communicates some data, but it's not like a tool where you can make serious decisions. Really the purpose is to create something that people can play around with and be excited and see data from a different perspective that they maybe haven't seen before. So that's my basic model, and yeah, obviously in my course we will do a deep dive of this model, but this is basically the foundation, the three main concepts, the audience, the data, and the non-data, and you, and how they influence the design. And ultimately what I try to do here is to learn people about the thinking process behind these creative visualizations. And I think these are the main components that help you think about creative data visualizations. So, and with that, I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you very much for sharing your designs and your framework with us. I'm gonna go through the questions. So the first one is from Carla. And I think they're referring to your COVID visualization. They're asking, why is this info presented in donuts and not in bar charts? Usually bars are easier to compare.
I don't know. It's I was more thinking of progress bar, and yeah, you could do that. I thought visually it looked a little bit more appealing. It's also keeping in mind what you want to do with this visualization. My idea was to give people kind of a different look on data they're familiar with. And is it really important that they can make an exact comparison? There's also a description of each rate below each circle. So yeah, it's absolutely true. Bars are probably easier to compare. Then again, I would say that sometimes that's the fun part of creative data visualization. Sometimes it's not just about creating effective visualizations only. It's also about creating something, well, my own opinion, or something that I think looks nice, or and so it's really finding this balance, because you can, of course, you can also map your data to very expressive and obscure forms, it could still work, and the idea is still the same. But it's this balance that you need to find, where you try to find something that looks nice, but people can still get a sense out of it. But yeah, obviously, if this would be a tool for users to make serious decisions on a daily basis, yeah, I would probably have chosen bar charts. But that was not my target audience in this case. So.
That's actually a nice bridge to another question. So how do you find balance in the value of aesthetic design and a more direct and efficient way of data visualization? So you partly answered that, but anything to add?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't have a straightforward answer to that, other than, yeah, when you create a design, there are many things that you have to take into account, like who's going to use it. So is it going to be a tool, or is it going to be something that people are going to look at for 2 seconds and then go on to the next thing? Is it going to be used internally? Yeah, there are so many things, and sometimes there's a situation where you have, yeah, it makes sense to have more freedom to how you create, incorporate more aesthetic designs, and in other situations it is more, well, straightforward and purely about effectiveness. I think for me, I would say that most of my projects are focused on communicating something to at least a broader audience. And I would say that for most of those projects, it's not a situation where people are making serious decisions based on my visualization, but they want to be informed or entertained or something like that, or be surprised by a new look on data or something like that. And so usually I would say that, although there's some variation, but for many of my projects, I try to find kind of a middle ground. So they do inform to some extent, but it's not purely about effectiveness only, but also about creating something that looks nice.
And another question is, do you advise designers to be, I'm guessing designers that are working on data visualization specifically, to be data scientists as well? And if so, what do you think is the best starting point?
I don't know. It really depends. I'm not a data scientist myself, and I do create data visualizations. I think, well, the thing about data visualizations, at least the way that I create them, is I create them using coding, programming. So for me, it means you have to know how to code, and you have to know something about data, and you have to know something about design and usability. So for me, that's what makes it really exciting, because you have to know about a lot of things. Yeah, but it's not really necessary especially today. There are also quite a bit of tools that allow you to do pretty creative things. There's, for instance, a tool called Flourish, and there they have design templates which you can modify yourself. So if you know a little bit of programming, you can create very creative designs. So today there are quite a few options to create designs without programming knowledge and without knowing too much about data. On the other hand, if you do create data visualization or work with data, it would make sense to be at least a little bit knowledgeable about data and what makes sense and how to work and deal with it.
Yeah. And another question is, would you recommend some visualization coding frameworks or libraries that you like to use?
I would say that for all my projects, I use D3. That is, I think, the most used framework for data visualization. But I use that primarily for all the utility functions. For more complex visualizations, you often have a situation where, yeah, things become so complex that you need to manage the complexity in some way. So for quite some time, I've been using some standard web frameworks as well. And one that I've been using for the past 3 years, I think, is Svelte, which is a new web framework. It's just a general web framework, but it's a very good match for data visualization, and more data visualization creators are moving towards using Svelte as well. And for me, those are the two that I use all the time. I sometimes use, for if I need to do data processing, I use Python for that. Other than that, it really depends on the project. So if I do some things with three-dimensional things, then I use 3JS, which is my favorite library for that. But other than that, it just depends on the project, what I need.
And do you have some tips on how to make interactive visualizations work on mobile as well, looking at performance?
Well, I think for mobile there's performance. I'm not sure if that is necessarily the biggest challenge, actually, because especially modern phones, they're quite performant. So if it works on your desktop or your laptop, then it will probably work on your mobile phone as well with regards to performance. So for instance, I've done a project for the European Space Agency where I simulate 60,000 stars in the browser. And that performs also quite well on my phone. So that's not really the issue, I think. What's more of a challenge, I would say, is that you are dealing with a much smaller space. And so you have to decide, how am I going to deal with a situation where on a big screen I can show a lot, and on a small screen there's much less space available. So am I going to scale everything? Am I going to show a reduced version or a completely alternative version? How am I going to handle a situation where on laptop or desktop you can have mouse overs, and on phones it cannot, and on the phones you have your big fingers, and on laptop you have a thick mouse. So I think interaction in that sense is more of a concern, as well as the size of your display, than performance.
And I have a question myself. So you talked about emotions in your presentation. This might be a cookie question, I'm not sure. In your experience, is there a difference between different visualization in terms of evoking certain emotions? Do you find some visualizations better suited for certain feelings?
I don't know if there are specific topics or something that are more suitable, but there's one collection I just found out, I think last week, is by Density Design in Italy. And they have a huge collection of student projects. And if you Google on data poetry, then you can find a huge collection of student projects in which they, all these projects are based on data, but they use an interpretive type of mapping. So if, I don't know, if it's something fragile, maybe you show flowers or something. So a flower is not an exact representation of data, but it shows the concept. And so for every project they show, they describe what the metaphor is and what their intention is. And so they're all kind of interpretive ways of mapping data to some kind of representation. And another great project, maybe you've heard of that one, is Dear Data by Stephanie Posavec and Georgia Lupi. And that's also a project in which they send postcards to each other for a year. And every week they collected data about themselves, and on the front of the postcard they drew an infographic or a visualization, and on the back they created a legend. And they did this for a year, and it became a hugely successful project. And but the thing, what they did was also kind of interpretive mapping. So they did collect data, but they both don't know how to code, so they draw their designs by hand. And so not everything looks exactly the same, and sometimes it's just an idea of how data maps. And so I think, especially if you want to show something like this is bad, or this is good, or this is complex, or this is slow, or something like that, and that's more kind of a higher level message instead of specific patterns or structures or outliers or things like that, What you then can think of is more kind of interpretive ways of mapping data. So what kind of concepts would you think of when you want to communicate something like that?
Thank you so much. And again, thank you and all of our speakers for sharing your experiences, your wisdom, your designs, your research with us. It was very, very insightful, and I hope that the audience also found it as valuable as I did. I want to thank everyone for joining and sending their questions and learning takeaways in the chat and participating. And thank WBAA and my colleagues who made this happen. And I wish you a good day or night based on where you are. Bye.